September 7th, 2022. About 40 miles southeast of Jackson, in rural Mississippi, there used to be cotton fields that extended to the horizon, an empire based on ambition and agriculture, and wealth that came and went like morning mist. For many years, the Roberts Plantation estate had been neglected. Once the county's pride, the main house was a magnificent two-story timber building that now remained as a testament to deterioration. Long faded and peeling white paint exposed old wood underneath. Shutters hung free from corroded hinges, and windows were cracked. The roof sagged alarmingly, revealing rotten timbers due to missing shingles. Eroded brickwork and arched apertures on the foundation suggested that there were former storage vendors underneath the building. The ruins of what had once been a prosperous farming operation surrounded the main home. The site was littered with outbuildings made of wood that are currently in various states of collapse. Shadows and deterioration now occupied what had once been worker quarters or tool storage. In front of the house, an abandoned 1940s car lay decaying, its body covered in oxidation and dust, its tires long deflated. The grounds had been reclaimed by tall grass that was wild and uncultivated. Kudzu and other exotic weeds mixed with dead cotton plants, which were the remains of crops seeded decades before. In the 1920s, one of Mississippi's richest cotton magnates lived on the Roberts estate. A guy who had created an empire, employed hundreds of people, and whose name was respected in business circles from Memphis to New Orleans. A man whose disappearance on an August night in 1922 left a mystery that would last for a century. The property was acquired by new owners in September 2022. The estate was bought at auction by Heritage South Development, a business that specializes in historic property restoration. They had an ambitious strategy: bring the main home back to its previous splendor, conserve what remains of the outbuildings, and turn the land into a historical site and location for events. They thought the Roberts estate had historical significance that went beyond its present condition of disrepair. Structural engineers had to evaluate the property before rehabilitation could start. A team headed by structural engineer David Anderson, who has 30 years of experience with ancient buildings, arrived on September 7th to examine the foundation and assess the necessary renovations. David started evaluating the main house with his team. The building was in worse shape than the preliminary surveys had indicated. When the home was first erected in the 1890s, the brick foundation was severely deteriorated. However, David's eye was drawn to the arched apertures in the foundation brickwork. These apertures seemed to go to storage rooms beneath the main house, but they were partially hidden by a century's worth of vegetation growth and accumulated rubbish. Food, wine, and other items that benefited from cold, dark conditions were frequently stored in these cellars in the plantation homes of that era. However, these specific openings seem to have been purposefully sealed at some stage and filled with cement and bricks that weren't compatible with the original design. Someone blocked these off. David informed Jennifer Hayes, his assistant, when they looked at the sealed apertures. This isn't the original design. Based on the mortar style, this was completed later, possibly in the 20s or 30s. In order to examine the vast space beneath the house, they made the decision to open one of the blocked openings. They carefully removed enough bricks to make an aperture big enough to enter without causing more harm to the historic building. David illuminated the night with his flashlight. The space beyond was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling barely 6 feet high. The smell of rot and soil permeated the stale air that leaked out. Along one wall, he saw what looked to be storage racks that had decayed and fallen. And there was something on the ground that chilled David's blood, partially hidden by falling objects. Skeleton remains. In the shadows, where they had been for decades or even a century, were human skeletal remains. David phoned the police and withdrew right away. The Rankin County Sheriff's Department had secured the area by noon that day. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office forensic anthropologists arrived around nightfall. The remains and related artifacts would be meticulously excavated and examined over the next few days. The skeleton was largely finished. According to forensic analysis, the deceased was an adult guy who was probably in his 40s or 50s. Clothing fragments revealed men's formal attire from the early 20th century. A number of objects that had survived a century were found among the remains. A pocket watch with the initials MHR engraved on the case that is significantly tarnished but still identifiable. A gold signate ring featuring a family crest. The remains of what looked to be a wallet, with corroded metal clasps and nearly completely deteriorated leather. They brought in historical researchers. They looked through documents from the Roberts family, who had owned the estate in the early 20th century because of the initials MHR and the location. They discovered something amazing: a 1922 missing persons case involving the plantation's owner, Michael Harrison Roberts, who disappeared on August 12th of that year and has never been located. Although there were few dental records from that time period, the Roberts family had enough money to have dental work recorded. The archives of a Jackson dentist practice that had provided care for the Roberts family contained historical dental records. A likely match was found by comparison with the skeletal remains, but after a century, dental records alone could not provide complete confidence. Genealogical study provided more proof. There were surviving Roberts family descendants. A conclusive identification was obtained by DNA research that compared the skeletal remains to genetic material from known descendants. The remains belonged to Michael Harrison Roberts, who had been missing for precisely a century. Make sure to activate the notification bell and subscribe to this channel before we proceed with this mystery. The events of August 12, 1922 involved wealth, power, and a disappearance that stunned the people of Mississippi. You'll comprehend by the end how one of the most well-known businessmen in the state died in a walled cellar beneath his own house, and why it took a century to locate him. The questions investigators faced were frightening. Who killed Michael Harrison Roberts? He was hiding his own land, but why? And how could a murder in a crowded house go unreported for a century? In 1922, Michael Harrison Roberts was 45 years old, at the height of his wealth and power. He was 6 feet tall and had a strong physique from years of physical labor in his youth before his wealth permitted him to assign such tasks. By his mid-40s, his hair, which had been dark brown when he was younger, had started to turn gray at the temples. He had a well-groomed mustache in the manner that was fashionable for business people at the time. Those who knew him described his gray-blue eyes as calculating, the eyes of a man who meticulously evaluated every circumstance for potential advantage. Born in northern Mississippi in 1877, Michael was the son of a struggling 40-acre farmer. Just 12 years had passed since the Civil War ended, and the South's economy was still recuperating. Michael was raised with the knowledge that poverty was just a bad harvest away, and that security required not only diligence, but also astute preparation and a willingness to take measured risks. He had learned reading, writing, and math at a nearby school as part of his basic education. However, his true education came from witnessing his father's unsuccessful attempts to turn a profit from farming. From an early age, Michael realized that land ownership was insufficient. When opportunities presented themselves, you required capital to invest as well as size, efficiency, and market access. Michael left home at the age of 18 with $20 in savings and a resolve to construct something bigger than his father's 40 acres. He learned every facet of cotton farming and the agricultural industry, while working as a farmhand and later as an overseer for a larger plantation. By the time he was 25, he had acquired his first property, 80 acres of good cotton land close to what would eventually become the Roberts estate, after saving every penny he could and making wise investments. Michael created an empire out of just 80 acres. He grew gradually, acquiring land from households unable to pay taxes during recessions and buying nearby properties when owners were having financial difficulties. At the age of 23, he possessed 500 acres by 1900, 2,000 acres by 1910. The Roberts plantation covered more than 5,000 acres by 1920, making him one of the county's biggest landowners. His wealth was based on cotton. Early in the 20th century, cotton was a major industry in Mississippi, and Michael Roberts had a deeper understanding of it than most. In order to guarantee he got fair prices for his harvests, he made investments in cutting-edge machinery, adopted effective farming techniques, and cultivated connections with cotton buyers in Memphis and New Orleans. Michael had the financial resources to weather market downturns and frequently came out stronger by buying other farmers' land. However, Michael was more than just a large-scale farmer. He was an entrepreneur who saw the value of diversity. He had a cotton gin that, for a fee, processed the crops of lesser farms in addition to his own. He had stock in a railroad that carried cotton to markets. He made an investment in a Jackson bank. In 3 counties, he possessed rental properties. His estimated wealth by 1922 was about $2 million, or roughly $30 million in today's currency. At the age of 23, Michael was married in 1900. Elizabeth Chambers, his wife, was the daughter of a well-known Jackson lawyer. Both families benefited from their union. While Elizabeth's family developed ties to agricultural wealth, Michael obtained social respectability and connections to Mississippi's professional class. Their marriage was friendly, if not very passionate by all accounts. Harrison, their son, was born in 1901, and Margaret, their daughter, was born in 1904. Both children were adults in 1922. Harrison, a 21-year-old employee of the family firm, was trained to eventually assume plantation management. Margaret, who was 18, resided at home and was being prepped to marry a suitable match from another well-known Mississippi family. The main plantation house, a magnificent 2-story building that was abandoned and in disrepair a century later, was home to the Roberts family. That house was magnificent in 1922. Workers took great care of it. Its rooms were furnished with the finest pieces. The family hosted social events for the county's elite and meals for business associates on a regular basis. In corporate circles, Michael Roberts was seen as cunning, sometimes brutal, but typically trustworthy. He struck difficult deals while keeping his word. He had little tolerance for failure or justifications and demanded efficiency from his employees. He was more respected than liked. However, respect equates to power, and Michael possessed a great deal of power in Mississippi's political and business spheres. However, both opportunities and foes are brought about by wealth and power. Others had suffered as a result of Michael's ascent. Farmers he had bought land from in difficult times occasionally thought he had exploited them. His success infuriated rivals in the cotton industry. He was seen as an oppressor by labor organizations. Michael Harrison Roberts had established an empire by 1922. However, it is rare for empires to be established without inciting animosity. Michael had scheduled a business meeting at the Roberts estate for the weekend of August 12th to 13th, 1922. He'd brought many business associates from Jackson and Memphis to discuss potential investments in agricultural equipment manufacture. Cotton farming was becoming increasingly mechanized, and Michael saw opportunity in owning part of the manufacturing supply chain rather than just purchasing equipment. Saturday, August 12th, dawned hot and humid, typical for Mississippi in August. Michael reviewed financial records in his study during the morning. His guests started coming in that afternoon. By dusk, there were about 20 individuals. Michael's family, business associates, their spouses, and a number of well-known locals who had been invited to make the event more social than strictly professional. The Plantation House dining room served dinner at 7 o'clock p.m. As the polite host, Michael led the conversation about business prospects and shared anecdotes. After dinner, the men retreated to Michael's study to smoke cigars and discuss the suggested investments in more depth. The women remained in the parlor, chatting according to the conventions of the age. According to later testimony from those in attendance, Michael excused himself from the study at around 10 o'clock p.m. He informed his visitors that he needed to get some paperwork from a different area of the house. He wanted them to examine financial estimates. He exited the study and entered the house's main hall. Nobody ever acknowledged seeing Michael Harrison Roberts alive again after that. When 20 minutes passed and he hadn't returned, his son Harrison went seeking for him. The records Michael had specified weren't in the locations Harrison investigated. Michael wasn't in his bedroom, the library, the dining room, or any of the obvious spots. When Michael still hadn't shown up by 11 p.m., worry gave way to alarm. The entire house and the surrounding grounds were searched by the visitors, the family, and the domestic workers. They didn't find anything. Michael's car remained at its garage. His bedroom included his wallet, keys, and personal belongings. Nothing had been taken with him. He had just disappeared from his own house in the midst of a family and visitor gathering. Someone had called the local sheriff by midnight. A thorough examination had begun before dawn. However, Michael Harrison Roberts was never located despite thorough searches, interviews with all those in attendance, an inspection of the property and adjacent regions. He seemed to have left reality itself. He was neither dead nor living, and Michael's body remained in a walled cellar, lying in darkness, waiting a century to be found beneath the very house where his guests had congregated, where his family searched in bewilderment and rising horror. August 12, 1922. On a Saturday night at the Roberts Plantation estate, business and social responsibilities blended together. Agreements were discussed over whiskey and cigars, and the machinery of Mississippi commerce in the early 20th century operated in parlors and study spaces rather than offices. Some of Mississippi's most well-known businessmen were on the guest list for that evening. Thomas Sullivan, the owner of an agricultural equipment manufacturing company, was from Memphis. Robert Davis, a banker Michael had done business with for years, came from Jackson. Daniel Martinez, who ran cotton gins in 3 counties, was also there. James Clark, who had lately made an investment in automobile sales as motors started to replace horses, and William Anderson, who controlled railway shares. To make the event more socially balanced, the Roberts family invited a number of well-known local families, and each guy brought his spouse. There were about 20 individuals in all that evening, including the Roberts family. Michael, his daughter Margaret, his son Harrison, and his wife Elizabeth. The evening went according to the customs of those kinds of events back then. Between 5 and 6 p.m., guests arrived. They enjoyed the plantation house and gardens, were given drinks, and had courteous conversations. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at 7 o'clock p.m. The sumptuous supper, which included several dishes, great wines from Michael's vendor, and conversation about everything from the weather to politics to business opportunities, was cooked by the Robert family's cook with help from domestic workers. As was traditional at the time, the group split along gender lines after dinner at 8:30 p.m. After retiring to the parlor, the women would mingle, maybe play the piano, and talk about social issues and families. The men relocated to Michael's study, a first-floor chamber with wood panels where Michael carried out most of his business. They dreamed study was where the real purpose of the evening would unfold. Michael wanted to talk to his visitors about an investment opportunity, a joint venture to build an agricultural equipment manufacturing factory. Cotton farming was changing and becoming more automated. Equipment that had previously been imported or bought from northern manufacturers might be made locally, generating revenue and supporting southern agricultural interests. The study's conversation was lively but friendly. Production costs and market demand were discussed by Thomas Sullivan, who had previously produced such equipment in Memphis. Robert Davis talked about finance arrangements. Daniel Martinez discussed the equipment that farmers most required. Michael Roberts described his goals: a location in Mississippi that would be nearer to the farms using the equipment, lowering transportation expenses, and generating jobs locally. Michael requested that whiskey be delivered from the house's supply at approximately 9:30 p.m. Samuel Thompson, a member of the home staff who had worked for the Roberts family for 10 years, subsequently testified that he had carried the whiskey to the study at Michael's request. He had observed all of the men smoking cigars and conversing. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. According to several witnesses, Michael stated he wanted to get some financial paperwork at around 10 o'clock p.m. Earlier in the evening, he had brought up these estimates, which were numbers that demonstrated the industrial venture's prospective profitability. He promised to return in a few minutes and said they were in a safe in a different area of the house. Michael walked out of the study. He left via the study door and turned left into the main corridor that spanned the length of the first floor, according to testimony from a number of the men who were there. The dining room, the parlor where the women were gathered, and the back of the home, which contained a library, an a secondary office, and storage spaces, were all accessible via the corridor. Even after a century, it is still unknown what came next. Michael Roberts never went back to the study. That much is certain. He never found the projections he had described. And Michael vanished sometime between leaving that study and wherever he had planned to go. The males in the study were initially unconcerned. Conversations about business went on. They surmised that Michael might have been delayed in getting the paperwork, or that he had taken a break to talk to his wife or take care of a domestic issue. However, after 15 and then 20 minutes, the conversation started to stall. Their host was where? Harrison, Michael's son, made the decision to see how his father was doing at around 10:25 p.m. He followed his father's path as he exited the study and made his way through the home. The library was vacant when he checked it. There was nobody in the backup office. He went upstairs and looked in his parents' bedroom. His father was nowhere to be found, but his mother's possessions were there. He went back downstairs and examined the kitchen, dining room, and pantries. At around 10:35 p.m., Harrison came back to the study and told the visitors that he was unable to find his father. Concern turned to alarm at this moment. The entire group, men and women alike, started methodically searching the house. Every room on both floors was examined. They examined storage spaces, opened closets, and examined restrooms. Nothing. The hunt had spread outside by 11 p.m. The visitors and domestic workers searched the immediate area using lamps and flashlights. The stable where the horses were housed. Nobody was present. Michael's car was kept in the garage. The vehicle was there. However, Michael wasn't. The land is dotted with empty outbuildings and storage sheds. Michael's personal belongings, including his wallet with cash and identity documents, his keys, and his pocket watch, which he always carried, were found in his bedroom at some time during this search. This finding was concerning. Why would Michael have left the property without these things? And where was he if he hadn't gone? Michael's wife, Elizabeth Roberts, demanded that the sheriff be called at around midnight. On Sunday, August 13th, at around 1 in the morning, Sheriff James Wilson arrived to the Roberts estate after one of the guests went into town to pick him up. Having worked for the E.E. County for 15 years, Sheriff Wilson was a capable law enforcement officer. He understood the peculiarities of the case right away. During a social event, a well-known businessman disappeared from his own house. He had not been observed leaving the property. His car and personal belongings were still there. There were no indications of conflict or strife. Wilson coordinated a more comprehensive search. Dozens of people searched the plantation grounds as Sunday morning broke. Within a mile of the main home, every building, structure, and field was inspected. Nothing. Wilson conducted interviews with everyone who had attended the night before. They all told the same story. Around 10 o'clock p.m., Michael had left the study to get some paperwork. After that, nobody had seen him. Nobody had heard anything out of the ordinary. There were no yells, no noises of fight, and no signs of commotion. Wilson conducted interviews with the household staff as well. A chef, a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, a driver, and a number of other individuals who carried out various tasks were employed by the Roberts household in 1922. They were all questioned. They all said they had no idea of Michael's disappearance. Over the next few days and weeks, the probe grew. They called in the state police. The family engaged private detectives. Every facet of Michael's life was scrutinized for any indication of potential events. One of the most perplexing cases in Mississippi history soon emerged from the investigation into Michael Harrison Roberts' disappearance. Sheriff Wilson investigated every option in collaboration with state detectives. Michael's voluntary disappearance was one of the early theories. His financial records were scrutinized by investigators in an attempt to find any indication of problems that would have led him to escape. They discovered the contrary. Michael had a well-organized financial situation. He made money on his plantation. He made wise investments. He was debt-free. There was no financial justification for his disappearance. Investigators also investigated Michael's private life. Did he have marital issues or romantic entanglements? There was evidence that Michael and Elizabeth had a steady, if not passionate, marriage. There were no signs of scandals or extramarital affairs. His connections with his kids appeared to be typical. His private life seemed ordinary. Is it possible that Michael was the victim of foul play? Considering the situation, This appeared most likely. However, who and why? Investigators found a number of possible suspects, including competitors in the business world who might be jealous of Michael's achievements. In the cutthroat world of cotton farming, Michael had established his empire in part by exploiting the mistakes of others. A number of farmers who had lost land to Michael were located and interrogated. For the evening of August 12th, everyone had an excuse. None appeared to have the means or chance to force a man to leave his own house during a social event. Michael may be seen as an oppressor by labor advocates. Plantation owners were occasionally targeted during the labor turmoil that swept through America in the early 1920s. However, in August 1922, investigators discovered no proof of labor group activities near Robert's estate. Michael had not received any threats. Someone in attendance at the actual event. Maybe the most unsettling possibility was this. It's highly likely that Michael was killed inside or close to the house. Someone who was there that night had access to the house, and had a chance would be the most likely culprit. But who and why? Everyone in attendance on August 12th had their backgrounds and possible motivations thoroughly investigated by investigators. All of the business associates appeared to get along well with Michael. They would all profit from the planned manufacturing project. None seemed to have any motive to hurt him. The domestic workers were extensively examined. Such inquiries were complicated in 1922 by issues of race and class in Mississippi. A number of the employees were black and held jobs typical of the time. Due to the racial preconceptions of the investigators, these employees were subjected to tougher interrogation and more suspicion than they should have. Michael's own family was investigated even though no proof ever surfaced linking any of them. Those closest to the victim are always suspects in every murder or disappearance. However, what would be their motivation? Harrison, Michael's son, was being prepared to take over the company. Harrison was interested in his father's ongoing achievements. If anything were to happen to Michael, Elizabeth, his wife, would not be financially secure. His daughter, Margaret, had no obvious motive. Nevertheless, investigators examined their actions and remarks thoroughly. There were several searches of Robert's estate. Every structure, building, and possible hiding spot was inspected. However, there were restrictions on the search. At more than 5,000 acres, the property was enormous. Assuming that Michael's body would be in close proximity to his last known location if he had been murdered, investigators concentrated on the main house and its surrounding area. The cellar spaces beneath the main home were not properly examined by the investigators. They peered into the obvious celling entry, which was a stairwell that descended from the kitchen to a storage cellar containing wine and stored foods. When the cellar was examined, nothing out of the ordinary was discovered. However, there were additional selling spaces and smaller storage spaces that could only be accessed via the foundation's arched apertures. Areas that had, at some point, either before or soon after August 19th, 22, been purposefully sealed with brick and mortar. Why weren't these enclosed areas looked into? In part because they weren't readily apparent. Vegetation and accumulated trash covered the sealed apertures. They appear to be a component of the initial foundation construction. They didn't seem to be leading somewhere noteworthy. Additionally, research methodologies were less advanced in 1922 than they are now. Forensic technology, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar that could have found a body concealed in an enclosed area were just non-existent. The probe languished as the weeks became into months. Michael Harrison Roberts had just disappeared. Every lead had been followed. Each theory was looked into. There was no explanation for his disappearance or what had happened to him. The Roberts family filed a petition to have Michael deemed legally dead in 1923, a year after he vanished. In order to settle his estate and enable the family to proceed, this was required. The court approved this request in 1925. Despite the fact that no body had been discovered, Michael Harrison Roberts was officially proclaimed dead. There is no known cause of death. There was no justification given. Harrison, the Roberts' son, continued to administer the plantation under Elizabeth's supervision. Daily activities. But the heyday of the plantation was coming to an end. Mississippi was severely impacted by the 1920s agricultural depression. Prices for cotton dropped. Smaller plantations were becoming outdated due to the mechanization that Michael had intended to invest in. There was more competition from other areas. The Roberts enterprise suffered in the absence of Michael's connections and commercial sense. At the age of 58, Elizabeth Roberts passed away in 1935. Harrison oversaw the plantation until 1948, at which point he sold the majority of the land to settle debts. The family still owned the main house and the surrounding 100 acres of land, but they were being neglected more and more. In the 1930s, Michael's daughter Margaret got married and went away. The land was not of any importance to her. The Roberts estate was essentially deserted by the 1960s. The property passed through a number of owners who had no sentimental relationship to its past after the last family member with any connection to it passed away. The house started to slowly deteriorate because it was no longer maintained. The outbuildings fell apart. Wilderness returned to the fields. The disappearance of Michael Harrison Roberts became a local folktale. Stories went around. Theories proliferated. Some thought he had been killed. Others believed he would flee. Some said he had been kidnapped. However, the truth remained concealed since there was no proof, no body, and no conclusion. Additionally, Michael Harrison Roberts' remains remained in darkness beneath the dilapidated plantation home in a walled cellar that no one had bothered to thoroughly examine, waiting a century to tell their story. Mississippi, America, and the world underwent significant transformations in the century between Michael Harrison Roberts' disappearance in 1922 and the finding of his remains in 2022. The Great Depression began in the Roaring '20s. Global politics were altered by World War II. The South was changed by the Civil Rights Movement. From radio to television to the internet, technology progressed. Michael's former world turned into a historical curiosity. However, the Roberts plantation estate turned into a sort of time capsule as it was gradually forgotten and deserted. Beneath its floors, the main home kept a secret that no one alive recalled as it deteriorated. Over the years, the property changed hands several times. A developer bought it in the 1960s with the intention of dividing the property for residential development. When development became unprofitable due to economic conditions, that idea was abandoned. Someone who intended to renovate the main home purchased the property in the 1980s. Lack of financing prevented that restoration from ever happening. In the 2000s, the property was sold once more to an investor who did nothing with it for years until losing it to tax foreclosure. The enigma surrounding Michael Roberts sometimes reappeared in local historical attention during the course of several decades. A local historian produced a piece about well-known Mississippi families in the 1950s and 1970s that included a segment regarding Roberts' disappearance. The article listed the known facts, discussed the many possibilities, and came to the conclusion that it was unlikely that the truth would ever be discovered. Michael Roberts was the subject of a chapter written by a true crime author studying unsolved Mississippi in the 1990s. Although all direct witnesses had already passed away, the author spoke with families of those who had attended the event in August 1922. The disappearance was portrayed in the chapter as a persistent mystery. A wealthy guy disappears from his own house when visitors are around, and he is never located. There were several theories, including murder, voluntary disappearance, and kidnapping, but none of them were definitively backed by the available data. Locals came to refer to the Roberts estate as haunted. Every now and then, teenagers would challenge one another to go to the deserted plantation home at night. There were rumors of weird noises, spectral beings, and mysterious happenings. The creepy atmosphere of the place probably reinforced these fantasies, yet the stories continued. With its collapsing roof and damaged windows, the abandoned house definitely had the appearance of a haunted mansion. The county authorities condemned the estate by 2020. The main residence was risky to enter due to structural flaws. A number of the outbuildings had fallen apart entirely. The property was deemed a liability and an eyesore that required either demolition or restoration. The property was bought by Heritage South Development at auction in June 2022 for about $300,000. The business specialized in historical restoration, turning dilapidated old buildings into museums, boutique hotels, or event spaces. Despite the disarray of the Roberts estate, they recognized opportunity in it. In subsequent interviews, Heritage South's president, Cal Martinez, outlined their goals. An essential aspect of Mississippi history was represented by the Roberts Plantation. Indeed, it was connected to the plantation system, which left a tangled legacy. However, maintaining these assets enables us to share the complete narrative of our history, including both the successes and the injustices. The main house would be restored, historical exhibits on plantation life from many angles would be made, and a venue that could make money while conserving history would be established. In the summer of 2022, Heritage South started organizing the E-Restoration. To evaluate the property and ascertain what rehabilitation would be necessary, they engaged structural engineer David Anderson. According to David's initial evaluation in August 2022, the main home was in bad shape, but probably could be saved with a lot of work. His primary interest was the foundation. Early in September 2022, David came back to the site with a more thorough inspection plan. He and his group started thoroughly inspecting the foundation on September 7th. He became aware of the filled gaps in the brickwork at that point. For decades, plants, accumulated garbage, and a century of neglect had hidden the arched holes in the Roberts Plantation foundation. At first view, they seemed to be merely ornamental arches that added visual interest to the foundation's architectural detail. However, David Anderson, who has spent decades studying old structures, saw that the brickwork in these arched sections wasn't consistent with the rest of the foundation. Compared to the original structure, the mortar was slightly fresher, different, and less expertly laid. Openings had been filled by someone. David told his assistant Jennifer Hayes, who was recording the inspection, that these led someplace, most likely to storage vendors. In homes from this era, that was typical. Several cellar areas that are utilized for various activities and accessible from various locations. At some point, someone sealed these up. Documenting the sealed openings and moving on would be standard procedure. However, David suggested opening one to look at the area beyond because to his professional thoroughness and curiosity. Before starting the repair process, Heritage South wanted to be fully informed about the property's structure. It was necessary to evaluate the structural integrity of any hidden cellars, as well as any possible difficulties, such as water damage or foundation issues. In order to create access, David and his colleagues painstakingly removed enough bricks from one of the sealed apertures on September 7th, 2022. In order to preserve as much of the old brickwork as possible, the work was done slowly and carefully. They had made an entrance that was about 3 feet wide and 4 feet high by late morning. David pointed a powerful spotlight into the shadows. The beam showed a tiny area, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a low ceiling that might only be 6 feet high. The cellar, which had brick walls and a floor, seemed to have been dug out of the ground beneath the home. The remnants of rotten and collapsed wooden shelving lined one wall. Debris, broken masonry, decayed wood, and what looked to be pieces of fabric covered the floor. Then something caught David's light, causing him to freeze. A human skull was partially hidden by fallen objects among the rubble on the cellar floor. David phoned the police and left the opening right away. The Rankin County Sheriff's Department arrived at midday. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office sent forensic experts to the location by the afternoon. After the property was obtained, the underground cellar was carefully excavated. Forensic anthropologists labored in the small cellar area for the next 3 days, painstakingly clearing trash and excavating the skeletal remains. Every piece of bone, relic, and detail could provide details about the victim's identity and manner of death. Therefore, the job was extremely careful. The remnants were nearly whole. A whole skeleton, now buried beneath accumulated debris, was found on what would have been the cellar floor. Based on the location and absence of evidence of fight against the cellar walls, it seemed that the body was dumped in the cellar soon after death rather than dying there. After a century, the preservation was not as awful as one might anticipate, but it was still poor. 3 corpses had been shielded from weather and scavengers by the walled cellar. Some breakdown processes have been slowed by the cool, dark surroundings. Small bones from the hands and feet were either missing or dispersed, but the skeleton itself was mostly undamaged. Nearly all of the clothes had fallen apart. There were only pieces left. Fragments of what looked to be a suit jacket, identifiable by buttons, and the remains of an advanced zipper from the 1920s. Pieces of a shirt that were so ruined they were hardly recognizable. Fragments of leather that could have been belts or shoes. However, because of their materials, a few things had survived in better shape. A gold-plated pocket watch that is intact despite significant tarnish. The case's engraving was visible after thorough cleaning. One of the finger bones still has the initials MHR and a gold signate ring. There was a family crest on the ring. Even after a century of oxidation, the design is still recognizable. The ruins of a wallet. The leather was nearly all rotted, yet it still had metal clasps and what looked like rusted pennies. The skeletal remains forensic examination yielded more details. Based on where patterns and bone development, the person was male and between 45 and 50 years old at the time of death. A height of about 6 feet is approximated. Significant damage was evident in the skull, including a fracture on the left side that would have been caused by a strong impact from a blunt object. This trauma would have been lethal or almost lethal. There were no other indications of damage, indicating that this one strike was the cause of death, but identification required more than just physical traits. The signate ring and initials on the pocket watch suggested an identification, but additional proof was needed. Historical research got underway right away. Investigators looked into the Roberts family's documents after discovering the MHR initials at the Roberts Plantation estate. The file on Michael Harrison Roberts, who was reported missing on August 19th and 22nd, was discovered. The forensic analysis agreed with the description of Michael found in those documents. 6 feet tall, male, mid-40s. The initials were the same. Roberts' family records were compared to a photograph of the signate ring's family crest. A match. Could identification be assured, though, after a century? Michael Harrison Roberts' descendants were found by genealogical researchers. Margaret, his daughter, was married and had kids. In 2022, there were still a number of great-great-grandchildren living in that line. After being approached, these descendants consented to donate DNA samples. Final confirmation was obtained by comparing the genetic material from the skeletal remains with DNA from known descendants. A match to a non-Roberts family member has an infinite, decimally tiny statistical chance. There was no doubt about the identity. The remains of Michael Harrison Roberts, who had been missing since August 12, 1922, were discovered in a walled cellar under his own home 100 years later. One question was addressed when Michael Harrison Roberts' remains were found a century after he vanished. He was where? But brought up a lot of others. He was killed by whom? Why? And how could a murder in a crowded house go unreported? Forensic evidence can only show so much after a century. The skeletal remains revealed Michael's mode of death. A blunt object strike to the head that is lethal. The remains' position revealed where his body had been concealed. However, a century after the event, it was impossible to definitively identify the murderer. To determine the most likely answer, investigators and forensic historians reviewed the evidence and historical documents. The following is a theory, not a verified fact, based on the evidence that is currently available. On the evening of August 12, 1922, Michael Harrison Roberts was most likely slain by someone who was present at the event. His body was discovered in a sealed cellar that was not accidentally accessible. Someone decided to conceal a body in the area after learning about it. The crime was concealed by the sealing of the cellar entry, which forensic analysis of the brickwork indicated occurred about 1922. Who possessed the information, chance, and motivation? This is still conjecture after a century, but a number of theories have surfaced. Someone working at Michael's home. These people were familiar with every aspect of the estate, even areas like the secret cellar that guests would be unaware of. They would have had the means to seal the cellar's entry. However, what would be their motivation? Employer mistreatment, long-standing grudges, or maybe a particular incident that led to violence that night. These motivations are unknown in the absence of testimony from long-dead individuals. Michael's relative. Even though it was the most concerning possibility, it couldn't be ruled out. Harrison, Michael's son, was there that night and was eligible to receive his father's estate. Harrison was already being prepared for leadership, and by all accounts, their connection was positive. Elizabeth, Michael's wife, would take over the estate, but she would no longer have her husband's economic sense, which kept the enterprise lucrative. Margaret, his daughter, had no clear motivation. However, family members would have been familiar with the property's hidden areas. One of the present business companions. There might have been unspoken issues with the suggested industrial endeavor. It's possible that someone benefited from Michael's passing in ways that weren't obvious a century later. Although they typically involve financial gain, which the authorities were unable to determine in this instance, business motives for murder are frequent. This is the most plausible theory in light of the available data and historical background. Someone with access to the residence and in-depth knowledge of the property killed Michael. The murder most likely resulted from a disagreement or altercation that turned violent rather than being planned. In a panic, the murderer realized they had to conceal the body and recalled the secret cellar area. In order to avoid being discovered, they shut the entrance after placing Michael's body there. Timing was the killer's greatest advantage. Searchers couldn't see the selling space. The sealed cellar opening was overlooked due to the evening's confusion and the chaos of investigating a vast property. And any tangible evidence at the crime site degraded as the days, weeks, and months went by. If the murderer lived during the ensuing years, they most likely buried their secret decades ago. Is it possible to definitively resolve the case today? Most likely not. Everyone who was there on August 12, 1922, has passed on. After a century, there is very little tangible proof. The historical documents offer information, but they don't draw conclusions. The murder of Michael Harrison Roberts is probably going to go unsolved. A century-old crime for which there are too many potential suspects and insufficient concrete proof to identify the perpetrator. For Michael's descendants, the finding of his remains provided some closure. Great-great-grandchildren who had grown up hearing family tales about the enigmatic disappearance of their ancestor now had a general understanding of his fate. Michael Harrison Roberts was finally buried in a Jackson cemetery in October 2022. His remains were interred with an ED gravestone that recognized his life and the enigma surrounding his demise. Roberts, Michael Harrison, 1877-1922. Home at last, after a century of absence. The renovation of the Roberts Plantation estate proceeded, but with a new component. In order to preserve the underground cellar as a gloomy reminder of the plantation's complicated past, Heritage South made the decision to incorporate it within the historical account. Tours of the renovated property would reveal a variety of narratives. The architectural significance, the agricultural heritage, and yes, the century-long unsolved murder mystery. What actually became to Michael Harrison Roberts then? We are aware that he was killed on August 12, 1922. His body was concealed in a subterranean cellar beneath his own house after he was struck in the head and slain. We are aware that despite an investigation, the murder went unreported, the murderer eluded prosecution, and Michael's family lived the remainder of their lives unaware that he had been under their feet the entire time. We are unsure of who used the weapon, what provoked the assault, and whether the murder was premeditated or unplanned. As completely as Michael's body was interred beneath bricks and mortar, these details perished with everyone in attendance that August evening. Michael Harrison Roberts' story serves as a reminder that having money and influence does not shield one from violence. That crimes may go unreported for many generations until they are accidentally discovered. That even if justice is delayed by a century, it is still a form of justice, and that historical mysteries can occasionally be solved in unexpected ways. The empire that Michael Harrison Roberts established ought to have lasted for many centuries. Rather, at the age of 45, his life ended violently. Someone he most likely knew was hiding his body. His absence left everyone involved in a mystery that persisted for a long time. His plantation, a testament to his prosperity, deteriorated over many years before eventually disclosing the secret it had held for a century. Michael Harrison Roberts, may you rest in peace. Your empire has vanished. Others have inherited your fortune. But at last, your tale has been shared. Even though it's incomplete, you've been discovered, interred, and remembered. Finally, after a century, your